there are two things I wanted you to look at as part of this chapter. Okay, this is the first one. We call this system of physiologic change, okay, the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, the RAA. Okay, so here, let me sort those. The key spots here are renin, angiotensin, and aldosterone. Okay. And what this system is this is our system for what happens when blood pressure or oxygen delivery is too low. Okay, and the most likely trigger for this system's response is fluid loss, fluid deprivation, or hemorrhage. Okay? Yes?
Could you turn integrity on?
I did.
Oh.
It's recording me right now.
Okay, thank you.
You just can't see it. But it is on. So, when would you get those things? Well, fluid loss, you might get that in a gastrointestinal illness that causes diarrhea. So like cholera, for example, causes very watery diarrhea, causes fluid loss. Fluid deprivation, you might get in a desert environment or other exposure environment. You might also get it in somebody who cannot get water on their own. So this might be somebody with advanced dementia, somebody with paraplegia, who is unable to move on their own, or newborns can get into this too because they can't get fluid on their own. They need parents or other caregivers to do that. And then the third spot is hemorrhage. So if you've lost a lot of blood, this is going to trigger. So it all starts over here. So when the systemic blood pressure or oxygen carrying capacity of the blood is diminished, the kidney responds to that by producing two things. Renin, which goes on to do a bunch of other things, and erythropoietin. This is also referred to as EPO. Okay? Erythropoietin is the hormone that controls red blood cell production. So when erythropoietin goes up, the red blood cell production goes up at the bone marrow. Okay? So that's going to solve part of the problem, because typically if your blood pressure is too low or your oxygen content of your blood is too low, part of your problem is you don't have enough red cells. Okay, so the kidney responds in that way. It makes red blood cells happen. But then renin goes on to do these other things. Renin is an enzyme, okay, and it's an enzyme that turns angiotensinogen, okay, which is found in the blood all the time, into angiotensin 1, which we typically call AT1, okay, so angiotensin 1. Angiotensin by itself, angiotensin 1, doesn't do very much, okay? It has to be converted into its active form. So angiotensin 1 becomes angiotensin 2, that's AT2, okay? And that transformation occurs in the lungs, and the enzyme that does that is called the ACE enzyme, angiotensin converting enzyme. Now, you will, in another class, learn that there's a whole family of medications that inhibit this enzyme, called ACE inhibitors. Probably, next to beta blockers, the most prescribed anti-hypertension drug in the world, right, are the angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors. But for now, we're looking at normal. So angiotensin 1 gets changed into angiotensin 2, which has three main effects. One is aldosterone production is increased. Remember, aldosterone was one of the adrenal cortex hormones. We called it a mineralocorticoid because it controls salt and water levels. As aldosterone levels go up at the kidney, there is fluid retention, so that's water retention, and sodium chloride retention. Now, we're going to learn in our renal chapter that water always follows salt. Okay, so if you move sodium chloride from a compartment to another compartment, water follows along behind. Okay, so these two things are linked together. Fluid retention and salt retention go together. Okay, so that's aldosterone is released, causes that to happen. What this does is this reduces water loss. Okay, the kidneys are making urine all the time, okay, to get rid of waste products. Well, when aldosterone is present, the amount of urine that's made is much less. So water loss is reduced. You put that together with angiotensin II triggers ADH, antidiuretic hormone, to be released. Antidiuretic hormone makes you thirsty, so you drink. And it also causes fluid retention at the kidney. Okay, so those two things together result in an increase in fluid volume. An increase in fluid volume means an increase in venous return, right? We talked about that last time, which results in an increase in stroke volume, cardiac output, and blood pressure, all the way back over here. So what about this piece? Well, angiotensin II also causes vasoconstriction, causes peripheral vasoconstriction, which elevates total peripheral resistance, which also elevates blood pressure. Okay? Now the difference is this can happen over minutes. The top two, or bottom ones, so the fluid pieces happen over hours, typically. So this one's faster than the others. But ultimately, this system responds to a decrease in blood pressure or a decrease in oxygen by creating an increase in fluid volume and total peripheral resistance, which elevates blood pressure and thus reduces the original effect, right? So it's a classic one of those homeostasis circles, okay? So this is the case with too little fluid. Okay, so it's the RAA, renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Now, there is another system for too much fluid. And this goes into the heart. Okay, so when venous return is very high, okay, so very high venous return, the heart gets stretched. So the atria are stretched. When the atria are stretched, they release a hormone called ANP, Atrial Natriuretic Peptide. Okay? Atrial Natriuretic Peptide. Now, this isn't nature like the beautiful stuff outside. This is nature like natrium, which is sodium, right? Na is sodium. Well, its real name is natrium. So this is a hormone from the atria of the heart. It's a peptide, so it's a peptide hormone. And its effects are natriuretic. In other words, etic is to urinate, like diuretic, right? And natrium is sodium. So the end result here is increased sodium loss. Increased sodium loss at the kidney causes an increase of water loss because water follows the salt. Well, as water is lost, venous return goes down, right, because the fluid volume goes down, so the amount of blood returning to the heart goes down, and then this pathway is shut back off. Okay, so that's the too little fluid. This is the too much fluid. Now, out there in the wild, where we all live, this doesn't happen very often, okay? This only happens if you have taken in way more fluid than you needed. So if you're on one of those crazy diets where you're supposed to drink 2 gallons of water a day or whatever, that's going to sit you into this. You're just going to pee it all out. But the more common one is this one over here, the too little fluid. Because we get into this probably every week. Some of us hit the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone because we haven't had, it's 5 o'clock and we haven't drank much that day. We're sweating and we're evaporating water out of our lungs, so our fluid level gets too low and this triggers, and suddenly we get thirsty. It's the only one we're really aware of. Plus our urine outputs go down. So these are the two systems that, in the end of that slide set, there were a lot of those circle homeostasis diagrams. Well, these are the two systems they're talking about. Okay, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and this is called the atrial natriuretic peptide system. Okay. All right, so I wanted to cover that because we have to get on to this next thing, but I have one more thing I want to talk about. Can I pull the thing down? Yes. This requires the trainers. There we go. I think. Okay. Last slide in this chapter is this guy. Okay. And this is a good lead into the next chapter anyway. Okay. This is showing you the movement of fluid. Note fluid is in big bold letters there. At the capillary. So things move at the capillary in more than one way. One way is water and stuff dissolved in it moves, okay, in and out of the capillary. More importantly is molecules move in and out of the capillary. So most of the things that we've talked about the capillary, oxygen goes out, carbon dioxide goes in. Nutrients go out to the cells, waste products come back in. Those are happening by diffusion. Okay, so the molecules are moving, they're not moving in fluid, they're moving by diffusion. But there is some fluid movement at the capillary too. Okay, and that's what this is, this picture is showing you. Okay, so artery over here, arterial over here, venule over here. And like we're going to see at a couple of different places, including at the kidney, how things move are dependent upon forces, different forces at work. Okay, and some of them are in opposition. And that's really what I wanted to cover here, because sometimes students struggle with that piece. Okay, so we have pressures pushing out, and we have pressures pulling in. All right, so what are the pressures we're talking about? Okay, so pushing out all the time, so that's this arrow, this one, and this one, is blood pressure. Okay, there's inside the capillary, the blood is under pressure. So that pressure is pushing on the walls. That means that some fluid is going to get pushed through the little holes in the walls. Okay, just like, you've got on your sink a thing they call an aerator, where you turn it on and it spreads the water out through a bunch of little holes, right? That doesn't work unless there's pressure on the other side. So the capillaries do have little tiny holes. So the blood pressure in here pushes fluid out. We call that capillary hydrostatic pressure. That's blood pressure, is all that is. So capillary because it's at the capillary, hydrostatic because that's the kind of pressure it is. It's water pushing, I think. And we can see that it changes across the capillary bed. Early in the capillary, it's high. Late in the capillary, it's low. Okay, so in the beginning part of the capillary, fluid is being pushed out because this hydrostatic pressure in here is greater than the other pressure, which is a pulling pressure. Okay, that pulling pressure, which is in yellow here, is the harder one to understand, and that is this guy. Blood colloid osmotic pressure. Okay, the simplest way to explain this is blood has a lot of stuff dissolved in it, right? Plasma proteins, ions, nutrients, waste. There's a ton of stuff dissolved in blood. And you've all heard of osmosis. Well, the short version of osmosis is water is always pulled toward the fluid that has the most stuff in it, most stuff dissolved in it. So that's what we have going on here. Blood has a ton of stuff dissolved in it, and the tissue out here has very little. So the fluid is always being pulled in towards the colloid, or towards all that dissolved stuff. So it creates a pressure. So offsetting the pressure pushing out is this pulling pressure pulling back in. So at the beginning of the capillary, the blood pressure wins. So fluid exits the capillary bed because this pressure is greater than this one. All right? But as we move across the capillary bed, the blood pressure decreases because of pressures being lost. So in the center, they balance, so we don't get any fluid movement. And then on the vein side of things, the colloid osmotic pressure wins. So some of the fluid that was pushed out at the beginning gets pulled back in at the end, okay, because of this colloid osmotic pressure. It's one of the reasons why those plasma proteins like albumin are so important. Without them, we don't have this pulling pressure, and essentially your blood volume ends up in your tissues and not in your vessels because it just all leaks out because there's nothing to pull it back in. All right, so if we look at a whole day's worth at a capillary bed, in all the capillary beds of the body, we see that about 24 liters is pushed out, 20.4 liters is pulled back in. So there's a difference there, right, of 3.6 liters. Well, where does that go? It goes into the lymphatic system, which is where we pick up in the next chapter here, okay? So the rest of the slides in this set are for your practice. That's all testable information. That's stuff we've now covered. But it runs through the different, like the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, how it works in response to a decrease in blood pressure or oxygen concentration or so on. Okay, so you're on your own for that stuff because we got to move on. Okay, let me get to lymphatic system. Okay, because, see, first slide in this next chapter, same one we were just looking at, right? So where does that extra 3.6 liters go? Okay, so most of it stays in the cardiovascular system. You know, so fluid goes out, fluid gets pulled back in. 20.4 liters goes back out because 24 liters came back in. Well, the rest of it goes into these green vessels called the lymphatic capillaries. So here's our tissue bed, right? Here's some tissue, could be nerve, or could be muscle, could be skin, any of those. Here's our arterioles, right? Here's our capillary bed, all stuff we've talked about. Here's the venule. And then we've got this big, strange, tree-looking green thing. All right, well, next to the capillary beds are these very thin-walled vessels who evolved to collect excess fluid. All right, so 3.6 liters, remember, leaves the vessel system and doesn't come back in. Well, that's what we see in the black lines here. Fluid is being pushed out all the time. Excuse me, I got a tickle in my throat. And that's shown in these black arrows. Well, that fluid, it can't just stay in the tissue, or we would get more and more swollen all the time, right? You know, we'd get more and more fluid in our tissues, and that wouldn't work well for anything. So that fluid ends up in these capillaries, these lymphatic capillaries, which then carry that fluid back into the cardiovascular system so that it can be circulated again. Okay, so this is where that 3.6 liters goes. So the principal job of the lymphatic system, which you can see a sort of overview of here, those lymphatic capillaries join and make larger and larger thin tubes, and we get this second network of vessels that essentially drain excess fluid from all the tissues of the body. Okay, so that fluid that leaks out can get put back in to the cardiovascular system. Now, a problem with this setup is these lymphatic capillaries are very easy to get into. So it isn't just fluid that ends up in these lymphatics. It's all kinds of stuff. So it's bacteria from little skin damage that we all get just in everyday life, debris from dead cells or cells that didn't form right, and then we also find immune system cells in the lymphatic system as well. So you get your lymphocytes, and some of your other white blood cells are found there as well. So it can't be as simple as just taking that fluid and putting it back into the cardiovascular system. Because if that's all it was, all the time we'd have bacteria circulating in our blood. You know, so we'd have an instant source of infection all the time. So there has to be some other system. And that system is the rest of the lymphatic system. Okay? So, you know, here is our tissue again. The black lines are fluid leaving the capillaries, entering the lymphatics, right? And you can see that unlike capillaries in the blood, the capillaries of the lymphatics have these holes in between them. You see like here, and here, and here, and here, and here. And not only are they holes, I don't have a picture of this, but they kind of overlap. To allow very easy entry of the memories. Okay, so in cross-section, one of these lymphatic capillaries. All right, so here's an epithelial cell, right? A lymphatic endothelial cell. Here's another one. Oh, wrong way. And then here's a third one. So what I want you to see is, you see how they overlap? They don't come next to each other. They go like this, like shingles on a roof do. Well, these cells are very flexible. So this little flap here can move. And what happens is, say you've got some debris here, right, floating around in the tissue. It pushes on this flap, and the flap moves, right, like that. So the door opens, kind of. Now this thing goes in here, so now it's here. And then, so it's moved. And that little flap then snaps back, like that. So real easy entry, where you got into the lymphatics as easily as pushing on one of these cells and getting in. Now, the reverse doesn't happen, though, because of this arrangement. So now it's trapped. It can't get out because this one doesn't move in that same way. So the short version is lymphatics are easy to get into, hard to get out of, which is why they end up collecting all kinds of stuff. They collect bacteria, they collect immune system cells, they collect debris, anything that doesn't belong in a tissue ends up in the lymphatics because it's like a trap. Once you get in, you can't get out. Okay, so the only place that this chunk of something can go is to follow the flow of the fluid in this system back up towards the cardiovascular system. Now, it's going to make some stops at some filters along the way called lymph nodes, so that if this is a bad thing, it doesn't get into the rest of the body. Okay? So what we find in these lymphatic capillaries is a fluid called lymph. Okay? Lymph is one of the body's fluids. So there's blood, there's lymph, there's cerebrospinal fluid, there's pericardial fluid and pleural fluid, and there's a number of others. But lymph is very similar to blood without the blood cells. So it's mostly water and proteins. So it's like plasma, remember the non-cellular part of blood, with whatever it has collected from the tissues along with it. Okay, so what you see here, this is the flow of lymph through that system. So the system starts not as tubes, but as pouches. Do you see how this is a pouch and not a tube? But then once the pouches join together, then it does start to make tubes that flow along with the arteries and veins. So typically, if your microscope is good enough and your specimen is good enough, wherever you have an artery and a vein, there'll be a lymphatic there too. Now, in real practical life, we never see these. It's not because they don't exist, it's because they're exceedingly fragile. So the lymphatic vessels, their walls are never more than a few cells thick. So they're very thin-walled. You know, we talked about how veins have pretty thin walls, but you can compare in that picture, and that vein wall is about 3 times the size of the lymphatic vessel wall. Okay, so this is a system, we know it's there, because when it's dysfunctional, you get major problems, but you can't really observe it, because these tubes, the walls are so thin that as you open the tissue, you end up destroying them. So we know they're there, but we can't see them. I also want you to see that this right here, just like we find in medium-sized veins, all lymphatic vessels have valves that allow fluid to flow only in one direction. So it means that fluid never flows backwards in the lymphatic system. It only flows from the lymphatic capillaries, these guys, up towards the rest of the body, like we see here. So it only flows towards the trunk from the arms and legs. It only flows up from the abdomen, down from the head, because it's all headed right here, as we're going to talk about in a minute. Okay, so that's the lymphatic system. Now, we connect this system with the immune system because this is one of the highways that the immune system cells use to travel around the body. So when we look at lymph, when we sample lymph, we always find immune system cells in there. So it's sort of a natural connection. Did I see a question? No. Okay, so here's a picture of that valve under the microscope. And because of this valve, it means, do you remember the skeletal muscle pump we talked about? How as muscle contracts around veins, it works as a pump to push blood towards the heart? The lymphatic system uses that same system. So another reason why when you're on a long car trip or plane trip and your ankles might swell a bit is because not only are the veins not being assisted with getting blood back up, but the lymphatics aren't either, okay? Because the lymphatic system does not have a pump. You know, like there is no heart for the lymphatic system. The only way blood or lymph moves back to the cardiovascular system is by muscle contraction. Now, another trick the body uses is arteries tend to pulse, right? So arteries pulse, and as they pulse, they too help to push lymph upwards towards the heart because they get squeezed around the outside. All right. So where does it all go in the end? Well, in the chest is where the lymphatic system gets largest. So we have a large lymphatic network that runs up the back of the thorax, just in front of the vertebral column. And there are two spots where the lymphatic system dumps into the cardiovascular system. On the right-hand side, we have the right lymphatic duct, which is right here. This has anatomy on this slide. You want to circle stuff? Okay, so right lymphatic duct, I want you to know that. Okay, that's here. And thoracic duct, right here. That's all I want you to know. You don't need to know these trunks. So thoracic duct on the left and lymphatic duct on the right. Now, this is an example where the body is not symmetric. You know, usually we have a right and a left side and they match. Well, in lymphatic flow, it doesn't match. The upper right quarter, so the right side of your head, your right arm, your upper right chest, and your upper right back, all empty the lymph from those areas, empty into the cardiovascular system here at the right lymphatic duct. And the right lymphatic duct empties into the right subclavian vein, which you should already know, right? The rest of the body, so the left side of the head, chest, left arm, and the whole trunk from the diaphragm on down, empties into the thoracic duct, which is found here on the left-hand side. So you can imagine the thoracic duct is quite a bit larger than the right lymphatic duct is. In fact, for a long time, the right lymphatic duct, people didn't know it existed or weren't sure it existed because it's so thin and small. But the thoracic duct is something you can actually see with the naked eye if you're careful. So all that drainage goes, so it's a 3/4, 1/4 system. This is important to know. The reason why this is important to know is one of the ways infection spreads from one part of the body to another is through the lymphatic system. One way that cancer spreads from one place to another is through the lymphatic system. So because of this asymmetry, you know, let's say you had a liver cancer that was metastasizing. Well, it's not going to probably end up in your right lung or your right brain. It's going to end up in your left side because there's two different, these systems are separate. So it's hard to get from one to the other. Okay. So that's sort of the lymphatic vessel system in short version.
What's
Yes.
the point in having Is fluid taken out of that point? Is there a filter in there somewhere?
There is. Lymph nodes are going to filter it. But what's the point? It's unavoidable. In other words, there would have always been fluid leaking into the tissues, because if our blood had so much colloid pressure that didn't happen, it would be very viscous and hard to circulate. So there just had to be. It's like there's no way to make it not leaky. So if you've got a roof that you can't fix because of other reasons, well, you just need a system to get rid of the water. Yeah, which is kind of how our bodies evolved. Okay, so that's the anatomy piece. So the lymphatic vessel system is like a second vessel system that collects fluid and returns it to the cardiovascular system. Everybody kind of got that? Okay, because sort of the rest of this is more about the immune system. Okay, so what do we find in the lymphatic vessels, in the lymph? Well, one of the things we find there are lymphocytes. And we're going to talk a lot more about lymphocytes later, but this is sort of the introduction to the family, right? So lymphocytes are not just one kind of cell. There are 3 kinds of cells, and each of those types has different subfamilies. Okay, so the 3 big ones. T cells get their name. T is for thymus. T cells spend some time in the thymus gland, which you may have never heard of the thymus gland, but it's found in the chest, upper part of the chest. We're going to talk about it more later. But it's sort of an immune system university, right? Cells go to the thymus to learn how to be good immune system cells, how to be good attacker cells. So T cells all spend time in the thymus gland before they go on to do their thing. Now, all lymphocytes are made in the bone marrow. So the thing that makes T cells different is they're made in the bone marrow, but then they travel off to the thymus where they spend some time, and then they go back out into the body and do their thing, right? Just like you all are going to go out into the workforce and make a ton of money and stuff. So T cells do that. That's about 80% of the T cells. Now, inside that group, there are 3 different categories. So there are cytotoxic T cells, and we're going to talk much more about all this later, I promise. But cytotoxic T cells are cell-to-cell combat killers. They kill cells that need killing. Now, why would cells need to kill other cells? Well, cancer cells need to be killed. Pre-cancer cells need to be killed. Virally infected cells usually need to be killed, right? Because they're going to keep making virus until they're destroyed or until they die from the virus itself. And certain bacteria live inside of cells, so the only way to kill the bacteria is to kill the cells they live inside of. So cyto is cell, toxic is bad for you, right, or bad. So these are cells that are bad for other cells, cytotoxic T cells. They play a major role in our virus and cancer immune system, okay, the cytotoxic T cells do. The second category are the helper T cells. They get their name because they don't participate in combat directly, but they assist all the cells that do. Okay, so we call them helper T cells. And that might seem like sort of a secondary role, but HIV causes acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, because of its effect on the helper T cells. So you see, you got to have helper T cells, otherwise you don't have a functioning immune system. And then the smallest group are the suppressor T cells. They work to turn the immune system off after it's been activated. Okay, so you don't have cells continually combating other cells. So those are those 3 types. B cells get their name because they come from the bone marrow. B is for bone marrow. B cells are baby plasma cells. B cells will, when they're activated and respond to their signal, they become protein factories. Plasma cells are protein factories, and the protein they make is antibodies. Antibodies, as we'll talk about at the end of this chapter, are sort of the silver bullet of the immune system. Once you have antibodies to a thing, you're going to destroy that pathogen in your body. So antibodies are the ticket to how we have been able to survive in an environment where there's all these bacteria and viruses and microorganisms that would very much like to eat our resources, right? So we'll talk more about how antibodies work, but for now, B cells, which look just like T cells, but they go on to become plasma cells when they're activated. And then the last group are the NK cells. NK stands for natural killer, okay? We call them natural killer cells because just like cytotoxic T cells, they kill other cells. They also kill bacteria cells and parasitic cells, any cells that don't belong. The difference between the NK cells and the T cells is they're sort of naturals at it. They don't have to go to the thymus to learn how to do it. They're simply born knowing how to kill cells that need killing. And it's a lot of research being done about natural killer cells because they may be one of the tickets to cure for cancer or a cure for certain autoimmune diseases. Is if we can somehow get the natural killer cells to recognize cells that need killing, you've got a built-in sort of chemotherapy system that's very highly specialized. All right, so much more on all three of these later, but lymphocytes, this is the family of lymphocytes. We already talked about this. So they all come from the bone marrow. T cells go to the thymus first, and then we'll talk about the different kinds of immunity later on. Just like all the white blood cells, lymphocytes found in the blood are just on their way somewhere. Okay, they don't live there. Most lymphocytes in the body are found in other tissues. Even though we find them in the blood, they're typically found in greater quantities in other places. So they just use the blood as their highway to get where they're going. All right. So one of the places that lymphocytes are found are in lymphoid tissues. These are lymphoid, just means tissues with lots of lymphocytes. Okay, and we find areas of so like this is intestinal tissue up here. And you can see how this little, this looks different, this mass of cells looks different. Well, this is a whole bunch of lymphocytes all in one place. And we find these lymphoid tissues anywhere where infection is likely to enter the body. Okay, so one of the places that bacteria would love to gain entry to our tissues is through the GI tract, right? None of the food we eat is sterile. So we ingest bacteria all the time. But in part, these lymphoid tissue areas stand guard so that that bacteria has no chance of getting into our tissues and into our bloodstream. Okay? So we find these in the intestine. We'll see them in the pharynx as the tonsils here in a minute. But these are lymphoid tissues. They're not organs, okay, because they're part of other organs. But they are areas of tissue in other organs where there are lots of lymphocytes. So this example is called a MALT, a mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. Why? Because it's associated with the mucosa. The outermost layer of the small intestine is a mucosal membrane, which means it's soft and wet so that stuff can pass through it. Well, soft and wet is exactly what bacteria like. So you've got to put some of your soldiers, some of your immune system cells, right there to prevent bacterial infection in the first place. So this is a MALT, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. The most famous lymphoid tissues are these guys, the tonsils. Everyone in the room, I'm sure, has heard of the tonsils, right? Because they can be trouble sometimes. We have 3 pairs of tonsils, okay? So we have the pharyngeal tonsil, which you can't usually see in people. It sits behind the nasal cavity, right? So here's the nasal cavity. Remember, it's square and sits underneath the eye. Far bigger than just the part that sticks out in front of your face where your glasses go, right? It goes all the way back to your pharynx. And sitting at the top there are the pharyngeal tonsils. These are also called the adenoids. Some of you may have heard them called that. Then we have the palatine tonsils. These are the ones you can see, right? So you open your mouth and say, ah, and there are these 2 little oval outcroppings from the side of your pharynx in between your second and third pharyngeal arches. Those are the palatine tonsils. And then deep at the base of your tongue, where your tongue attaches, which you can't see, but there is another set of tonsil or tonsils. Sometimes they're joined together. called the lingual tonsils. Okay, and all three of these look a lot like this: huge masses of lymphoid tissue, of lymphocytes. And why? Same reason as the mold. Because bacteria and viruses would very much like to gain access to us through the air that we breathe or through the food that we eat. So the pharyngeal tonsil sits right where air coming in from the nose has to make a bend to go down into the trachea. So air is hitting this spot all the time. So as air hits it, the pharyngeal tonsil gets to analyze it. Is there bacteria in this air? Is there virus in this air? And it can help to trigger an immune response if there is pathogen in the air we're breathing. Okay, so it sits there. The palatine tonsil does a similar thing for breathing through the mouth, right? When we breathe through our mouth, air goes past those palatine tonsils. Also, when we eat and drink, it goes past those. So analysis, the palatine tonsils can analyze what's coming in. The lingual tonsil, when we swallow, food comes right over the top of that lingual tonsil, so it makes direct contact with it. So all three of these spots are guard posts, watchtowers, so to speak, so that the immune system can keep an eye on what is coming into the body. Yes?
Why are the palatine tonsils affected by secondhand smoke?
But because secondhand smoke triggers an immune response. So it sees those complicated molecules as toxins, and toxins will generate an immune response. Yeah. And hold on just a minute, I'll get right back to you. So the ones that many of you have kids or will have kids, and you've heard that kids have tonsil problems. So it's a little thing I like to point out. It's the palatine tonsils are very large in children, and it's because their immune systems are still learning how to fight off all the diseases that are ever present in our environments. And because of that, because the palatine tonsils are big in kids, and because their mouths and heads are small, a lot of times the tonsil becomes too large for the child's head and throat. So it used to be that tonsils, the palatine tonsils in particular, were removed very often because they were big. Now we try not to do that anymore because it turns out tonsils protect us from infection. No big surprise. So if you don't have your tonsils or you had your tonsils removed, you will get more respiratory infections and more GI infections than somebody who does have their tonsils. So now we try to save the tonsils. And what usually the best approach is you just have to let the kid get bigger. As their head gets bigger, they grow into their big tonsils. So the problem goes away, essentially. But you had a question.
So like if they decide to remove tonsils because they're just too big for the child, like how would they need to do that? Like is it like because they're having a hard time swallowing? Like what does...
Hard time swallowing will do it. Hard time breathing will do it. Tonsils can cause sleep apnea in kids because they can get so big they have trouble with airflow when they get to sleep. Pain and missing school is a big one because inflamed tonsils can get infected. Big tonsils can get infected. But today they're much slower to go yank them out than they used to be. And tonsil removal is just nasty surgery because there's no elegance to it at all. They literally go in there with an instrument that's shaped like a sharp rake, and they just rake them off the side of the wall. So you get a ton of bleeding. The kids have these areas. It's like having a giant strawberry in your throat. It's very, very painful for them. And tonsils will grow back sometimes too because it's lymphoid tissue. It'll recover. Yeah.
So I had my tonsils and adenoids taken out, and it was because I just kept getting strep throat. Why would that
Yep.
be? Because
the tonsils get all wrinkly, and those little wrinkles are little good spots for bacteria to live. It's not a perfect system, certainly. Now, adenoids, another reason we'll take out adenoids. Snoring again, kids who snore really loud. Every once in a while, you'll find a kid who snores so loud you can hear them like outside, right? That's usually a kid with big adenoids because they go to sleep and the adenoids block the airway. And that means the kid's sleepy all day because they're not sleeping right. So that's a reason to take adenoids out. Another reason to take adenoids out is the adenoids sit right next to where the eustachian tube drains the middle ear. Remember we talked about that in our special senses? So when the adenoids are too big, they block that tube, so you get chronic middle ear infections then too. So one of the treatments for chronic middle ear is to go in and rip out the adenoids. Somebody else had a question.
So
Yes.
if they take out your tonsils and your adenoids, you won't get strep, but you'll get respiratory virus?
Yes, you'll get more respiratory viruses, yeah. And you can still get strep. You can still get it.
Seriously?
Yes, you can. It's not a cure. Strep, the truth about strep is some people carry strep in their bodies all the time. And those are the people that tend to get recurrent strep throat because it's already around them. So it isn't always that you got it from somebody else. It's sometimes you got it from yourself because it's in and around you anyway. And for people who are really like missing work or school because of that, they'll even sometimes just hammer you with antibiotics to try to destroy your resident population of strep so that you can get out of that strep cycle, which does happen to people. Other questions? Tonsils, always questions about tonsils. Yes?
So would it be a different type of surgery to remove the adenoids? Or would it be the same sort
It still is the sort of steely, nasty rake, and they
Even
just
though it's,
rake
like,
them
kind
off
of
the back.
further in there?
Yeah, the way to do it is, so they'll intubate the kid, right? So the kid has a breathing tube in. And then they either go back through the nose or they put the kid in hyperextension and then they use a mirror to go. They have special tools that wrap around and then scrape down. Yeah, if you get a chance to see ear, nose, and throat surgery, they're interesting surgeries. They're bloody, but you get to see some really carefully tuned instruments. Yeah.
Do they always scrape it? Because I've seen it and it wasn't that.
Do they burn them?
Yeah.
Sometimes they burn them. It depends on the shape of the tonsil and how completely they're trying to remove it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She also did work in different countries, and so she would show me pictures, and there they don't have anything, so they're just going in blind scraping.
Yes, scraping it off. And another thing they do today is they don't. In the past, they used to try to get the whole tonsil because it would grow back otherwise. Now they don't necessarily try to get the whole thing. They debulk it, so they go in and they take out a bunch of the mass, a bunch of the volume of it, so that the kid can swallow, but they still have the benefits of having those immune system cells there. All right, good. Well, we're out of time, so we'll stop there.